The Star Observer, you'd pick it up. It's got bumper to bumper from one page to the other. Just ads of people that passed away with photos on them. It was just terrible. Just to think, oh my God, who's going to be dead this week?
Everyone read the Star Observer every day, the names of all these people who died. Then we'd all get together at the vigils and we all went to the funerals together. I mean, seriously, you'd see the same faces.
It did seem to have this pattern of, well, first of all, it's people who you hear about or you know about, or somebody just disappears from the scene. And then it gets closer and it gets closer. And before you know it, your best friend's dead. Or your partner. Or you.
I remember this day, we were having breakfast and we were looking out on Oxford Street, and then we just saw people with their mothers or their boyfriends. It was sort of like they came out of the woodwork and they're all walking up towards St. Vincent's Hospital. And this is about 10 o'clock it would start. And you'd see literally 50, 60, 100 people walking towards St. Vincent's. And it was sort of like some sci-fi movie. It was really horrible. And we knew they were going to St. Vincent's. And they were going there for hope. There was nothing for them.
Welcome back to History Lab's Darlinghurst's AIDS crisis. I'm Regina Boutros. In our last episode, we travelled through the 80s as the community marshalled all its queer energy to face the virus. The safe sex sluts handed out condoms, the AIDS bust visited sex workers, and gym bunnies experimented with steroids as treatment. And Peter Vincent? He was in Vancouver with his partner Atty, competing in the gay games. Now, we land in the 1990s with historian Lee Boucher.
From the early 1990s, the obituaries are increasing in number every fortnight in the Star Observer. By 93, 94, there's up to 20 to 25 a fortnight. And it's this cascading and increasing rate of death and loss. And people in the neighbourhood are experiencing that in a very acute and concentrated and local way. So they're getting together with their friends at a cafe on Saturday morning, picking up the SSO and then folding out the obituary pages to find out who's died.
They were like messages between queer friends. One writes,
"Scream your tits off, girl."
And another says,
"My dancing queen, I miss you, I love you. Call me." Heaps of gossip.
One of the characteristics of AIDS in those years was incredible bodily vulnerability. The virus destroyed the immune system, and even the early treatments had really rough side effects.
Lizzie Griggs worked as a nurse at the Albion Street Clinic and saw it up close.
People getting more and more skeletal, muscle wasting, people not being able to socialise properly anymore because of the different infections, like the crypto.
That's cryptosporidium, a parasitic disease common to AIDS sufferers that causes shocking diarrhoea.
Like I had a friend that literally up Oxford Street would have to go bar to bar to bar to bar to be able to just shit his way up, to be able to get from A to B.
I think we like to imagine that everyone rallied around those who tested positive and then became sick. But stigma remained a powerful force. The rejection we often assume came from the straight world could also be experienced on the streets and in the bars around Darlow.
Peter Vincent's friend, Pierre Tuma.
Back in the day, you spiraled down from HIV to AIDS. You were looked at like if you had leprosy. Very few people would visit people.
Many gay men remember being worried about how their friends would respond to their seroconversion. Some talk about having to come out, but this time about their status. I'm wondering, how did this all play out on the gym floor?
Billy Kokonos was working at City Gym and training alongside Peter Vincent and Pierre.
There was a lot of fear. It was a taboo subject back in those days. A lot of people didn't even want to talk about it. There was a lot of members that we lost that we didn't know we had lost until many years later. And yeah, they just sort of went about it quietly their own way and went out their own way.
Peter Vincent had returned home from the Vancouver Gay Games triumphant. His steroid use had helped him maintain his vitality, but now he was losing weight rapidly. Billy could see that Peter was getting sick.
And I just thought, they're going to find a solution and, there's going to be, a way out. Pete's going to come back. He's a really strong guy. He trains, he looks after himself. He's very healthy. It's a minor thing. I didn't quite grasp the severity of AIDS at the time. I noticed Pete's physique started to deteriorate, and he found it hard to eat and to maintain the muscle that he had, and I thought, okay, it's a virus, we're going to get rid of it, it's just going through a bad phase. I had this thing in my head for some stupid reason that Pete was going to come out of it because he's Pete, he's strong, he's fine, he's going to be good.
While acute patients went towards 17, for palliative care, they checked into the hospice, which overlooks Green Park in Darlinghurst.
Was this at St Vincent's that you were visiting?
Peter's friend Pierre.
We all went to St Vincent's, and all our loved ones died at St Vincent's, at the hospice. Those walls at the hospice, if they could talk, man, so much went on. It was an amazing place. It was like hustling, bustling. It was like going to India. Everything is in one direction, the other direction. There's like crazy. Everyone inside was basically someone on his last leg. They have their pets with them. They have their family with them. There's no rules. Anything goes. The nurses are very easygoing. It was a place where you come out feeling really drained.
Do you know how long Peter was in the hospice for?
For about 6 months. Yeah. When you have full-blown AIDS, you either become deaf or you become blind. The ones like Peter, he used to listen to music a lot. So obviously his eardrums were a bit weaker, So he became deaf at the end. When he became deaf, I said to Atty, I think Peter's going to pass away very soon.
Peter's parents flew in from New Zealand and stayed with Tim, his brother.
He was down to 45 kgs. That last week, it was progressing so rapidly. And Eddie was up there every day giving him massage and whacking his lungs to try and get stuff moving like that. And he could see it wasn't working. And the last thing he ever said to Peter was, "Goodbye, my angel." And we all lost it, of course. And Mum did some prayers, being Catholic. And then we just had to walk out when he died, yeah. But we were lucky because his chest was totally heaving up off the bed at that stage, just to catch a breath. So there was no pain because he was on morphine like that. But it really just, he wasn't calm right to the last breath at all. He was battling up.
Peter's old friend, Frank McCabe, had taken off from Darlinghurst earlier that year.
To go back to Adelaide to clean my act up because I was in such a bad way. And the priest rang me on the 1st of December 1991 and said, "I just rang you to tell you that Peter Vincent passed away," and I was in total shock because I didn't even know he was sick or anything. I had no idea. I was out of contact, because I just wanted to get my shit together, and there's nothing I could do. I couldn't go and it was too late to go and see him.
His obituary in the Star was spare.
Peter Vincent passed away the 1st of December 1991, World AIDS Day. Our hero of the 1990 Gay Games will always be loved, Stephen and Paul.
Gay sports magazine, Warm Up, printed a half-page tribute, which concluded,
"Peter, we salute you, the perfect role model for all gay and lesbian sports people."
I miss him. Of course I do. I miss him. He was my best mate. He was like a brother. It's part of my family, it's something in me is missing from him not being there. I will never forget him. It's sort of... yeah.
Billy from City Gym.
I couldn't bring myself to go to Pete's funeral. I had lost my father probably 2 months earlier, and I was in a pretty bad state mentally, and I didn't really want to remember Pete in that way, to be honest with you. I wanted to remember Pete for, in full flight, in the best shape of his life, and looking amazing, which I do. And knowing Pete and knowing his personality, I knew what he wanted me to do was to get on with it and go and party and have a drink on him and live my life.
Tim Vincent.
There was a dance party that weekend, so Atty and I went, and he was in full leather. There were like 15,000 people there, and everyone knew what had happened.
I went and visited Atty a few times just to make sure he's okay, spent some time with him, and he was not the same guy after we lost Pete. They were very much in love, and I remember walking into his apartment. The walls were full of Peter's photos. I'm talking about probably 150, 200 photos, big framed photos of Peter everywhere. We spoke about Pete, and he put the music on, and we started partying and danced for like 3 or 4 hours, and then he had some friends come over, and we had our own little party to celebrate Pete, and it was a magical moment, and I still remember that day very clearly.
I've just spent 3.5 hours on the bus. I am coming to the library to look through issues of Australian Leatherman, which is a magazine that was published from the early 1990s. And I'm here because I know Peter Vincent's name appears on an AIDS quilt panel that was sewn by a member of the leather community, Gavin Kirkness, who took it to a leather event in 1992. And someone wrote Peter's name on it. So I'm sort of following that lead. I really want to know who wrote his name on the quilt. That's probably going to be impossible to figure out, though. Because, the person who made the panel took it to a Leather Pride event, laid it out at the event, and anyone could just walk up and write a name down.
The president of the Leather Club spoke about the quilt, which was decorated with cock rings, nipple clamps, and other leather paraphernalia. His words appeared in the Star Observer.
The Leather Pride quilt panel is our monument to the fallen dead. It is ours and ours alone. It is not gay, it is not lesbian. It belongs to the leather folk and to us alone, for they were our family, whoever else or whatever else they were. And at each unveiling, I will still cry and remember the loves and friendships that were lost, and the might have beens that never were.
There's no grave for Peter in Australia. Atty, beginning to get sick himself, returned with Peter's ashes to South Africa, where he died a few months later. The only place in Sydney where you'll find Peter's life commemorated is on the AIDS quilt. I first saw this panel when I entered Peter's name into the catalogue of Sydney's Powerhouse Museum. It appeared on their website in all its wonderful sex-positive glory. These quilt panels were designed to be the size of a grave. Each year they were laying out and growing in number. I still wonder if the person who wrote Peter's name went to this annual commemoration, or perhaps it just became too much.
Ian Innes worked out alongside Peter at City Gym.
The first time I saw the AIDS Memorial Quilt unfolding, I think was in maybe 1992, and it was at Darling Harbour for the first time. It was a huge crowd. There might have been 2,000 people there, and it was just, I sort of wasn't prepared for it. It was such an overwhelming, all his names and people I knew, just all there. I was like, I can't believe that. When you saw it for the first time, those panels individually were so personalised, like the way they were made, with memorabilia and effects and little poems and all that stuff is just so powerful in a way that most memorials aren't. And just the incredible diversity that's there, it was really, really overpowering seeing it.
I think the AIDS quilt is one of the more well-known artefacts of the AIDS crisis. When I look at the photos of these panels laying out, they look like an historical index of nearly overwhelming death. But for those living with HIV and AIDS, there were also equally important questions about how to live with the virus. ACT UP, which first emerged in the US, really got going in Australia in response to government inaction around medicines that could have real impact on the treatment of HIV and AIDS. If the quilt was an artefact of grief, ACT UP was animated by increasing frustration and anger.
By the early 1990s, AIDS patients in the US were using new medicines that were extending their lives. The first generation of drugs had horrific side effects, but they bought people time. In Australia, though, the government was slow to approve them. As a workaround, people at ACON began importing and selling the drugs in Sydney. Sarah Lubowitz at ACON in the early 90s.
I remember arriving one day on the second floor, the lift doors opened, and I remember just seeing these huge boxes everywhere, like taken over the reception area and down past people's offices, and it was all these drugs that they'd imported. I was like, wow, that's probably highly illegal. I was thinking
I'm pretty sure it was. So I know you got involved in ACT UP because ACON, in one sense, is the respectable face and they're working closely with government. But at the same time, ACT UP takes shape sort of in the late 80s.
Yes.
And how do you come to be involved with ACT UP?
I think someone at work must have told me, or when I was a volunteer there, someone must have told me that there was this meeting happening. And of course, I'm mixing with these people who are importing drugs, and they said, oh, you must come along. So I went along. And the first meeting, I can't remember where the first meeting was. I think it was the taxi club.
What were they like? What was the tone of the meetings like?
It was nearly all men, number one. Mm-hmm. Because there was a World AIDS conference happening in San Francisco, and to get into America, you had to fill out a form and you had to say that you weren't HIV positive, which was absolutely ridiculous because so many of the people going to those conferences as experts, because of what they were experiencing, weren't allowed to go. So a decision was made that we'd do a demonstration outside the American consulate.
And what happened at that?
People decided rather than damage the place in any way, that we would take lipstick along and that you could just write things in lipstick on the marble and it wouldn't be a problem. But the police had other ideas because they came along in very large numbers and they were aggressive immediately.
Sarah was taken to the police station.
As they took me down the corridor, they were punching me in the head and kicking me and hitting me. And
arrested and beaten.
The problem was, it wasn't a political thing. You had people who were maybe quite conservative, but you also had people there from the, Socialist Workers' Party, people who were used to demonstrating.
Sounds like, there was people in ACT UP who were angry, but you weren't necessarily angry.
Yeah, I suppose it was just the fact that they were going slow on the release of drugs, which meant that people were going to die.
Gay Waves in 1990 with host Michael.
ACT UP, first of all, stands for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It is a diverse, non-partisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis. There's one person a day dying from AIDS, so these people literally hold people's lives in their hands.
Bruce Carter had been working across healthcare and education in the face of the crisis. His partner was HIV positive, and when ACT UP got going,
I was right in there straight away. I was like, hey, yeah, I want to go to that. Like, absolutely. Like, let's, fuck these drug companies, this is outrageous. I mean, this whole narrative that Australia did AIDS really well. I mean, we did peer-led community health education really well, but not drugs in the beginning. And that seems to get forgotten. That's a lot of what ACT UP was about.
I'm here in the Domain in Sydney. It's a huge parkland that connects the CBD and the harbour right through to the neighbourhood. It now hosts open-air music events, festivals, and at lunchtime during the week, sports comps for the nearby city workers. My partner walks home from work every night through this big green expanse. We have a favourite tree. It's just over there. It's where I often meet him at the end of our work days. We then wander through the lanes of Darlow to get home. I can also remember holding hands with my friends, tears in my eyes, and jumping around like a teenager when Kylie performed here at World Pride. In the 1990s, though, this was a space filled with different kinds of queer feelings. This was where the annual candlelight vigil took place. Once a year, people would wind their way down through the laneways and streets of Darlinghurst to come together and commemorate.
We remember Keith, Ted, Steve, Robbie, Dave, Michael, Thomas.
Tess Sims.
They were lovely celebrations, I think, and remembrances.
Mm-hmm.
And they were always peaceful and with a lot of love in the space, wherever we were. It was nice. I liked it. I liked them. I liked being able to sit and remember. Having space just to do that, and that's all you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing else to be done.
And with other people.
And with other people who experience the same thing. And also quilt unfoldings were always wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, John, Graham, Peter.
I'm wondering also, one of the other things we have in mind, I think, with kind of the story of the epidemic, not just here but globally, is these kind of mass expressions of grief. The quilts, candlelight vigils, all of that kind of thing. Marches down Oxford Street as part of Mardi Gras, World AIDS Day, so on. Did you participate in any of those kind of events? Were they part of your world?
Bruce Carter.
Yeah, I did candlelight vigils. I do remember a really quite large candlelight vigil near the art gallery, and the names being read out was always really, really hard. There were always lovely times, though, to be with a whole bunch of people, and there were some beautiful things that happened out of all of this. So gay men and ducks came together, and people just coming up to you, giving you a hug at a candlelight memorial or something like that, because they could see you were upset. When you have someone in your life die, and it's just that moment, and it's just like, they are gone. You walk away from that in those moments. It was just so real,
Not everyone thought these moments of shared grief reflected the agony of the catastrophe. In 1992, the author Peter Blasey wrote,
I'm wondering about the therapeutic uses of grief versus anger. I seriously suggest we have a 2-minute scream for the 2.5 million who've died from AIDS around the world. It could be a scream of life, of rage and pain, or a war cry, or just a moan, or a loud sobbing and keening. It would be an expression of agony at the loss of friends and lovers and life partners, at the loss of flatmates, gym buddies, clients, workmates, dance partners and girlfriends.
By around 1994, crowds of around 8,000 to 10,000 were here for those vigils. They had first begun in Hyde Park in the early years of the epidemic, but they moved to the Domain because there wasn't enough space for all these mourners. These vigils, I think, weren't just about commemorating the dead, or indeed reminding the public about what was going on inside the neighbourhood. They held individuals, maybe only for a night, together in their grief. I'm just so struck by how the experience of AIDS intensified over this time, which was heightened by the concentrations and connections of the neighbourhood. It must have been overwhelming. When I see pictures from these vigils, everyone just looks so wrung out and exhausted.
Tess Sims was working as a carer for Community Support Network, or CSN, which provided in-home care for people living with HIV and AIDS.
Yeah, my youngest client was 17. So, babies. I was working full-time in the library, looking after my clients during the night and delivering training on the weekend.
You're living with a lot of death around you at that point in time.
Yes, I was. And, that was the peak years then, from about 94 to 98. There would be clients that a carer would see once a week for however long that lasted. We also did 24-hour palliative care, so we had teams of carers.
Do you reckon people got burnt out being CSN carers?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But I certainly found my boundaries. I'd been seeing this guy and...
You met a client?
I met a client, yes, he was a young man. He was from the country, hadn't told his parents that he was gay, never mind that he was positive and dying. And he hadn't long moved to Sydney, so he didn't have any friends. So he relied on me and I let him. I didn't maintain my boundary around being a volunteer or a best friend because we were not their friends. That's not why we were there as a volunteer. We could be friendly but not become a friend because that's the downhill slope.
For carers like Tess, the toll of caring for the sick was mounting. The pressure was being felt in all corners of the neighbourhood. Frank McCabe.
The clientele of the Oxford in those days was all the people that ran ACT UP. They're all the heavies of the Anti-Violence Project, ACT UP, all those things. They were all at the Oxford Hotel. So when you got there, they'd be at you all the time. Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do this? We need you to do this. Can you support us? And that alone would exhaust you.
At St Vincent's Hospital, in Ward 17, Bill Patterson was a nurse.
It was a diagnosis and treatment ward. If somebody was admitted to the ward for the first time, it's a terrifying experience, as you could imagine. It was probably an indication that you had 2 years or less to live. Most were young gay men, and when I say young, they're anything between, 18 and 40, I was 23 or 24, I think. And I used to dancing as fast as I could.
For Bill, caring for his patients was about relating to them as his peers, fellow young men.
In my introduction, when I used to talk to the people with HIV, I'd say, and I'd like you to tell me what you want from me. And there were a couple of things that were kind of ubiquitous. One was, I always want you to tell me the truth. And that's in plain language. And it's often the job of a nurse to interpret what the doctor's saying. Well, that means you're going to die, And you'd think that would make somebody very angry, but I would get this gratitude, from people. And the second thing was, please don't forget me. So one of the things that I had in my head was, as long as I live, you will be remembered. Now, I'm not holding myself up on any pedestal. I'm not the only person who can remember you and all of that. But it would be a way of honouring. But then I got HIV. And who's going to remember them? It was like a betrayal of a promise that I had made. Somebody that they could say that to.
The concentration and connection of Darlow, which had been an essential ingredient to the creation of this little queer world, were now having much more damaging and difficult effects. Lots of historical accounts talk about a community coming together at this point. But when I turned the recorder off, many of my interviewees talked to me about being tired and about how living in the thick of the epidemic felt sometimes unbearable. People like Frank, Tess and Bill couldn't walk down the street without bumping into a story about sickness, a request for help, or perhaps even a memory of someone they had lost. The bumps in the neighbourhood were starting to leave bruises.
So Andrew used to complain that we couldn't walk down Oxford Street on a Saturday morning without stopping every 15 minutes for somebody to say hello or to ask about this or to give you a hug or all of that stuff. It's just like, really, I think it bothered him. This is a period where that feeling of impotence in the face of this overwhelming phenomena was ubiquitous. You know, it was part of the damage that people were feeling. It was phenomenal. But no amount of, well, at least I have a purpose here, or at least I have a role here, and at least I don't feel impotent in this. That gets lost in the overwhelming nature of a pandemic in such a small demographic, you know?
I used to be in a room, every 6 guys in one room, and every morning you would wake up and have a look when they push the curtains out to see which one had passed the night before. And you know how many people passed, they died with no one with them? Nobody with them. Still up to date, I've got a fear of being alone. It reminds me always from the time when I was at the hospital. People don't talk, they just communicate with their eyes. There was a lot of pain in the eyes. It was a horrible time. It's like the Holocaust. It was terrible, you know.
Scott Petrie often visited friends who were sick.
There's a lot of fear. So didn't want to see it, didn't want to deal with it. You didn't know what was happening, and suddenly everything was fine and dandy, and then it wasn't. It was so enormous. And because you go into different wards and see so many people, and then you go chat to them because they had no one. And that was, I think, extremely confronting and sad because their family had dumped them. And I remember going to see one guy in particular, maybe in his 20s, late 20s or something, and he was very, very frail. But he decorated his room with all this fabric, this really colourful fabric that was his home, he said, and he said, come in. So I used to see him quite often. His partner had died, and then his family and his partner's family had dumped them, wiped them. And I was like, fuck, you're alone. If it wasn't for the volunteers and a lot of the nurses and things like that, it's like people were left to die. So very, very, very confronting.
And even though death was all around, they still found a way to have good, queer fun.
I know that the toilets were it was like a beat. It was a huge beat because he was saying, oh, it's hard to get into the toilet. So I'm like, oh. And he's like, oh, yeah, because everyone's getting off. I was like, oh, okay, well, you know. I don't know what to say. Yeah.
In 1996, experts discovered that a combination of existing medicines turned AIDS from a terminal to a chronic condition. And by the next year, for the first time in 10 years, the Sydney Star Observer hit the stands without a single obituary. But not everyone could cope with the horrifying side effects of combination treatments. Tess Zims.
There was also a whole group of people for whom either through choice, they didn't want to take those drugs that were going to age them and give them terrible side effects that they couldn't control, or for whom they just didn't work. And there were people for whom treatments did not work at that time. There was also people who could not maintain the very strict regimen, and if the regimen wasn't followed exactly with those drugs, they failed to work. So there was a whole group of people that were then deemed to be not looking after themselves, not doing the right thing by taking the drugs and stepping up and doing what they're supposed to do. So there was a sense that they were just ignored, that group of people. It was all the hype and the glory about how it's all going to be fabulous now. And they were not listened to. I don't think there was any article anywhere that ever said, of course, there are people for whom this isn't working, and we have to remember that.
The drugs arrived just in time for Pierre, who was at St. Vincent's, near death and with death all around him.
I kept on losing weight. You know, I went from 110 kilo to 35.
He survived AIDS, but left the hospital to find a changed world in Darlinghurst.
When I came out, the hospital, suddenly I looked around. Oh, it's like when a bomb explodes and everyone dies, and you turn around and see what the carnage had left behind. That's when I realized there are not too many. That was the very first time in my whole AIDS epidemic that I had time to reflect what's now. Where do we go from here?
It must have been so hard trying to forge a queer life in a neighbourhood that was now a reminder of so much loss.
I can remember we walked up a part of Burke Street, every house that had died, or both partners had died. So there might have been a stretch of like 20 houses, and in 15 houses, everyone had died. And so the people who were left, I think, just couldn't cope with that.
Scholars describe this as a traumascape, which captures quite poetically, I think, how it might have felt for those who lived through this crisis. While the AIDS quilt and the AIDS vigil had been powerful ways to share loss and grief during the crisis, in its aftermath, engagement with these living memorials quickly waned. After 1997, attendance at the AIDS vigils plummeted, and in a few years, only about 500 were attending the ceremony. A decision was made by the organisers of the Quilt project to donate it to the Powerhouse Museum. This was the best way to preserve it. It also meant the AIDS quilt became an archival object, wrapped up carefully and stored away, only ever to be touched by white-gloved hands.
There was a transition from guys who had HIV who knew they were going to die to guys who had HIV and said, actually, I'm not dying of AIDS, I'm living with HIV and I intend to keep living, which was really fantastic, a posture to have. But one of the consequences of that was they started looking at the quilt going, we don't want anything to do with that. That's all about death and loss, and that's not what's happening to us. We're living. And so it became really unfashionable to even mention the quilt.
It's almost as if these memorials were no longer fit for purpose. And I wonder if rather than bringing a community together, they instead began to feel like an inescapable reminder of an unbearable loss. It's very hard to land on a concrete number of lives lost in the hood, but it seems to me, from medical reports, from accounts at Albion Street, and from the stories that I've heard, that in 15 years, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the gay men in this neighbourhood died. I'm not sure how those who survived could have lived with that level of loss.
Pierre was one of the countless men who faced the question of how to live with the impact and memory of this catastrophe.
I was 38, 39. I tattooed my head as if God gave me a second chance to live. I spent all my fucking life working hard to be where I am, rejected by my family for being gay. And I looked after 3 partners that passed, one after the other, and buried so many friends. I said to my God, I don't want to die yet. I went and tattooed my head. When you have that lost child in the Bible, goes away and he comes back. I felt like I want to go into that desert, tattoo my head and come back. That's what I did. There's something liberated. I could walk down the street. I don't owe anyone anything. So you walk like a king.
Pierre's tattoo covers his whole shaved head. It's a big, bold, black pattern that spirals out from his crown with a tiny heart in its centre.
I think we're all a bit damaged, but to borrow from kintsugi is this Japanese principle where a broken
is that the gold in the...
mended with gold, so that what is a result of the kintsugi produces something which is far more valuable and beautiful than was there before, but would not have existed without the breaks, because there are fault lines that's in the principle. The kintsugi principle, when I first heard about it, and it was not during the pandemic, it was in the decades when I've tried to think and resolve some of the legacies that sit within me, it just seemed to be very comforting.
I'm here in Hyde Park, the imposing structure of the War Memorial, reminding everyone to remember Australia's fallen, its pool of reflection rippling in the wind. I used to wonder why there was no grand edifice to those lost during the AIDS crisis, particularly in Sydney's inner east. In the early 2000s, the journalist and activist David Menadue, who seroconverted in the early 80s, asked a similar question.
I know it is maybe too long a bow to draw to compare the AIDS epidemic with a war. But it felt like a war, with hundreds of our friends being cut down by a seemingly relentless enemy every year. If the RSL can bring out thousands of young people to remember lost relatives from wars that happened 70 or more years ago, maybe we can continue to provide a space for those in our community who've lost their loved ones.
Having spent more time in the archives of the 90s and heard the stories of those who lived through them, I now think I can understand why there was no formal AIDS memorial built in the wake of the crisis. The grief and loss were still too fresh, and the bruises that the worst of the crisis years left were still too tender. And for those living with HIV and AIDS, the idea of moving on was clearly impossible. And it's in that spirit that I've come to think we need historical narratives that don't clean up these experiences into a story about the miraculous Australian response. Miraculous though this manifestation of care most certainly was. And we need to remember that, in the face of all this, the dance floors were still packed. We need to learn how to walk around Darlinghurst with these uncomfortable and beautiful stories in our head, while also continuing the queer experiments and explorations this epidemic threatened to extinguish. Perhaps we need to keep trying to dance as fast as we can with these discomforting stories in mind. For it was in that combination that so many found a way to survive this catastrophe and care for those who didn't.
Thank you so much for listening to this special History Lab original series. There are many people we want to thank for bringing this series to life. First and most importantly, everyone who shared their stories and reflections on this podcast. Thank you for trusting us. We also want to thank the Paul Ramsay Foundation for its support of this Darlinghurst series and the larger Darlinghurst Public History Initiative, of which this is just a part. We could not have told these stories without you. And we also want to thank the State Library of New South Wales, whose oral history archive will store some of the stories you've heard over the last 3 episodes of History Lab. We would love to hear your feedback on this series, and indeed on any of our episodes. Please write to us at impactstudios@uts.edu.au, or share your thoughts via the comments in the History Lab feed at Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or on the Impact Studios YouTube channel. Stay tuned, we have a couple of bonus episodes coming up that will let you linger a little longer in Darlinghurst. Thanks for listening.